Is this a period canon? Did the Jesuits wear black or orange robes? Were people really boiled alive? Did samurai wear beards? What are these funny shapes on the battlements? We will be answering all of these questions and many more on this video. It's going to be great. So thank you so much for joining. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. The series Shogun is based on a homonymous novel written in the 1970s. For my trailer analysis and first reaction, I did a blind look into what was represented, meaning that at that time I hadn't watched the 1980s series and I hadn't read the book. So in that case, I was trying to examine strictly the historical accuracy of what was shown at face value. But today our analysis will be much more complete in the sense that it will be structured in a comparative key. We won't just look at the 2024 Shogun or first episode and then compare it to the historical events. We will do that of course, but we will also compare it to the original 1980 series and the book itself. As of the making of this video, I watched all the way up to episode 4 and I have to say I really like it. So if you are into Feudal Japan, you should definitely check it out. Alright, so as we begin the show, one of the first things we are told is when this is all happening, so the time frame or time period, and we are in 1600. As we always do on this channel, we're going to see that and trying to understand how faithful it is to the armor, clothing, weaponry, culture, religion of the time. But of course we do have to keep in mind that this is not based on a history book, it's based on a novel, so a certain level or drift, if you will, can be expected and somewhat justified since this is a novel, and a good one at that. So it's fictionalized history. With that being said, I'll tell you right now that the level of attention to detail when it comes to historical accuracy is mind-blowing. Now there are a few things that they got wrong, which of course I'll bring forth, but there are so many little things that you might have missed, to be honest, and hopefully they'd be interesting to show you here, that once you see, you'll be like, who did this? I mean, they had some incredible historical advisors, let me tell you that. So, for context, we are at the very end of the Sengoku era, or Sengoku Jidai, right before the beginning of the Edo period. I reckon this is a great choice when it comes to setting a novel and then consequently the TV series, because we have a lot of things that are happening at this time. Not only we've got a country that has been struck for over 150 years of relentless war in a fragmentation political struggle for power, but it is also a time of change due to the interactions with Western European powers and how those affected both domestic and international law, policies and politics, effectively shaping new paradigms within said international discourse. All of this will lead to cross-cultural exchange, including religion, both expansion and rivalry. As it is explained in the show, we see Catholics versus Protestants, although I have to say that the way the show represents it kind of goes a bit too far, as we will see. Several of the fictional characters in the show are actually based on real historical characters. Now I would like to focus on two specifically for this episode, John Blackthorne and Toranaga, of course. Now, are we talking about like loosely based or are these one-to-one? John Blackthorne, played by English actor Cosmo Jarvis in the 2024 version, played by American actor Richard Chamberlain in the 1980s version. Blackthorne is based on the historical William Adams, aka the English samurai, born in Gillingham, Kent, England in 1564. This is a small point of divergence with the character John Blackthorne, who instead in the TV series says he's from London, and in the book specifically says he's from the outskirts of Chatham, a small port near London. William Adams was an English navigator, pilot, chief officer working for the Dutch East India Company who ended up in Japan just like John. Okay, but what about the looks? Are those accurate? Well, the book is very specific when it comes to the description of John Blackthorne. We're told that he has got fair skin, is very tall, he has blue eyes and golden hair, and his hair is wavy. For reference, the words blue eyes appear 16 times in reference to him, while golden hair is used 8 times to describe him, and at one point he's referred to as the Golden Barbarian due to his hair color. And I will get back to the word barbarian and what Japanese words are used by the characters when they speak Japanese later on the video. Now both actors Jarvis and Chamberlain have got brown hair instead. With that being said, since Mr. Clavel himself was executive producer of the 1980s and he didn't seem to mind, As a little fun fact, even though we don't know what historical Adams looked like because we don't have period mentions nor portraits, we do have historical sketches like the one made by Dorothy Birmingham, this one here, and then in general the way we collectively imagine him and we have represented him, it's kind of funny that the actors look more like William Adams than they do John Blackthorne based on the book description. Just a funny little note. Toranaga, played by actor and co-producer Sanada Hiroyuki in the 2024 version and by legendary Mifune Toshiro in the 1980s Japanese version. Both spectacular choices if you ask me. If anyone could try and equal the work of Mifune-san, it would have to be Sanada-san, probably one of the most recognizable Japanese actors outside of Japan. Toranaga is based on the historical warlord Tokugawa Ieyasu. And when I say that Toranaga is based on Tokugawa Ieyasu, he's heavily based, like this is Tokugawa Ieyasu. With that being said, if there is any discrepancy, well, it's fine, because at the end of the day it could be considered artistic interpretation since they did change the name after all. Now, when it comes to the title of the first episode, we have the Japanese word anjin. Now, when it comes to this word, it means pilot, although I've got to say that in modern Japanese you don't really hear it that much, but yeah, that's what it means. I do think, however, that they took creative inspiration from the title of a book, specifically the eponymous book titled Anjin, The Life and Times of Samurai William Adams, 1564 to 1620, as seen through Japanese eyes, written by Hiromi Rogers, PhD. But that's just my guess. Alright, so as the episode begins, Blackthorn is on his ship and we see a few things. We see pistols and we see cannons. Now, I have a lot of things to say about Firearms when it comes to both the TV series, this first episode, and the book in general, but I will touch upon it later on the video because at first there are a few other things I want to touch upon first. But stay tuned because it's going to be really interesting. Note how Blackthorn refers to Japan as the dark land of the Japans. Now, it's absolutely fine for him to refer to Japan as the dark land, particularly from both the perspective of the English and the Dutch, whom still hadn't managed to reach it. But I'd like to underline here, just for clarity, that that's not how Europeans described Japan. Once again, it's not incorrect for him to say he still hasn't reached it. But if you do want to know what the Japanese thought of Japan in general and how they described it in period in a much nicer light, I suggest you to check out this book, link in the description. Okay, so we have reached the meat and bones of this review. We see warriors. Now, this Japanese word, which I'm going to pronounce correctly once in Japanese, I'm a Japanese teacher, samurai. Okay, I'm just going to say it with an English accent from now on so I don't drive you mad. But this word appears 1,008 times in the book, so they better get the samurai right. And boy, they do. Allow me to elaborate. As we progress in the scene, we see all of these Japanese soldiers, both samurai and ashigaru, so light infantry, arriving in the shore as the European ship approaches. And there is a lot to unpack here. First of all, the sort of armor that they're wearing, very historically accurate. I want to say, like the guy on the right, the way he's wearing the kabuto, so the helmet, it's correctly laced in the front. It's one of the many different ways in which you can tie the laces of your helmet. But look at the guy in the middle for a moment. The sort of door or cuirass that he's wearing reminds me of this specific type of samurai armor, which would be absolutely period. And by the way, I'm taking this picture from the Integrated Collection Database of the National Museum in Japan. And it's called that Nyodo Gusoku. It's a type of breastplate that was inspired by Buddhist iconography, and it's really cool to see it here because you don't usually get to see that sort of armor, so very nice. And also, it's interesting, this might be just me reading too deeply into it, but it's interesting that one of the soldiers is wearing a breastplate that represents Buddhism as they are meeting the Christian Westerners. I don't know, again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I really like the choice of armor there. Now, when it comes to the location, where are they? Well, keep in mind that the majority of the shots we get in the movie are shot in Canada, with the exception of a few that were shot both in the UK and in Japan. But when it comes to this specific shot, this seashore is in Vancouver Island. I do have to say though that if I didn't know that, if I hadn't done the research, I wouldn't have noticed. They chose a location which does look like Japan, so they fooled me, they would have fooled me. But where would this actually be? In Japan, but where? Well, once again, there is a difference between Blackthorn, the fictional character, and William Adams, the historical character, because Blackthorn, we are told in the book, they're shipwrecked in the Izu Peninsula in Honshu, Japan, so the main island, whereas the real historical character actually shipwrecked in Kyushu. Alright, so as the samurai and the ashigaru set foot on the ship, we have this shot. I wanted to stop it for a moment because there are two things we can discuss. The footwear he's wearing and his footing. Now, when it comes to the shoes that he's wearing, they're very traditional waraji and they're absolutely period. We see them all the time, made of straw or hemp, everywhere in iconography. Occasionally we see samurai wearing the more popular geta, and when I say more popular, I mean in the West imagination, but in reality, waraji would have been more typical. I own a pair. I wore them in the forest, on the sea, in the mountain, in the snow. They're very comfortable unless the terrain is very rocky, in which case you'll hate every minute of it because you'll hit your toes on every rock that you see. But yeah, probably not a problem in Japan, and definitely not a problem in this specific setting. But I do want you to focus on his footing right now, because that's also very interesting. That is the footing of a warrior. What I mean by that is that if you notice, his feet are creating an L. And this is typical even today with very traditional kenjutsu styles, such as the Katori Shinto-ryu kenjutsu. This is a very stable position, and the fact that this is a trained warrior, most likely a very battle-hardened warrior, because during the end of the Sengoku period is where you have the most brutal and battle-hardened samurai and warriors probably ever in Japanese history. So it's only natural that in a situation of stress and possible danger, he would automatically revert to combat footing as a sort of muscle memory for an experienced warrior. Very nice detail right there. As they enter, they find the first, I think he's dead, European, and then he checks his teeth and he notices his teeth are all weird. And then he says, starvation. Now, I'm not a medical professional, so I had to look this one up, but it seems to check out, in the sense that both malnutrition and starvation do cause several symptoms because of many critical medical conditions such as ketoacidosis, but in general the teeth do decay as a result of prolonged starvation, due to insufficient calcium levels in the body. That also affects the bones, by the way. But anyways, does it make sense that he would recognize that? Absolutely. I mean, once again, this is probably a man who has experienced all sorts of life and death situations and would be very familiar with this kind of symptom. This is also an interesting screen that I wanted to show when he's finding a cannonball from a crate and then he holds it in his hands. Once again, period accurate. You have to imagine that early European artillery actually used round stones, but then in 1400s is when iron cannonballs were developed, and by this time in 1600 they would have become ubiquitous, together with other types of projectiles and ammunition, including like grape shots. But in general, yes, he's holding something that is historically accurate. And there you go, heraldry on display. I really love the war banners, but if at any point during this review you had any reservations with the idea that Toranaga is in fact Tokugawa, well, there you have it. That is the Tokugawa clan symbol, and of course I happen to have it right here. Now, within Japanese warfare, there were all sorts of different types of war banners and battle standards. You could go from the sashimono that samurai and ashigaru would be wearing on their backs, all the way to the sort of war banners that we see here that are carried. You could refer to them as nobori or hatajirushi, but in general, the mounting can change. Sometimes they're like square and smaller. Sometimes they look like a cross. The mounting, the wooden parts have looked like a cross, and then you have the actual banner, and then you have the ones that look like this. It's kind of a sort of, I don't know, upside down L, if you will. Absolutely period accurate, and by the looks of it, it appears to be cotton, which is correct for the period, because in the early early Japanese warfare they were using silk, but then they stopped doing that and they decided to go for cotton because it was cheaper. But in general, very correct, historically accurate. And I love this. I'm having a great time, and if you are having a great time too, please subscribe and click the notification bell. Alright, so finally they reach Osaka-jo, so the castle of Osaka, and keep in mind that a lot of the castles that we see are CGI, once again because of course it wasn't shot much in Japan, it was mostly shot in Canada. But what's interesting to say is that there are situations in which instead they had to build an entire set to make it look Japanese and build pieces of castles and pieces of cities, and they did an exceptional job, as you will see very soon. The props are amazing. Okay, in this next shot, we see that there are soldiers that are holding spears. These are called yari in Japanese, although specifically I think in this case these are suyari, so they are straight spears, and I say that because I can see that the blade is probably 1 shaku in length, which would be about 30 centimeters, which I believe is like 12 or 13 inches. Sometimes I get confused with inches. But in general, they're accurate, and I actually own as an exact replica of those spears. I can't show it right now. I might have to just show you a different footage from earlier on because I had to leave it in Italy. Now I live in the US. It was kind of difficult to explain to post office why I had to ship a spear to Yeah, so the spear is still back home. Alright, this is what I'm talking about. This is a fantastic representation when it comes to props. So we have two archers stationed on top of a wall, and on said wall there are two holes, one in the shape of a rectangle and one in the shape of a circle. Now, these are called sama in Japanese, and what they are, they allow initially archers to shoot from inside the wall. If you look at the rectangle, which is the one made for archers specifically, you'll notice that it has this shape in the sense that it gets wider inside, so that it has a kind of a bigger space for the archer to shoot and aim, but then it becomes progressively smaller in order to offer or present a smaller target to the incoming enemies, so that, you know, in case they want to try and shoot inward. Now, the rectangular ones are specifically made for archers, and they're called yazama, ya meaning arrow, and then the circular ones, or the triangular ones, and we see these on the video game Sekiro, for example. They do really well, very good job there. These are meant for guns, so basically they are called teppozama, where teppo is the Japanese word for all sorts of pistols and firearms in general. Very well made. Alright, so as they reach Osaka-jo and Toranaga-san enters the castle, he swaps his long sword for a wakizashi, so the smaller sword that's once again period accurate, because that's what the bushi would do. They wouldn't just walk around with the long sword because they could, you know, they could bump onto things, but they still kept the shorter sword for personal defense. But what I want you to focus on now is their hairstyles, the beard, and the way they sit. First and foremost, we have to say that hairstyle in samurai history is not as monolithic as people think, in the sense that usually when you imagine the samurai, you think, well, someone with a shaved top of the head, which I just googled, and apparently it's called a pate in English. I didn't know. I had to Google the pronunciation because I was like, pate? And then the rest of the long hair is raised in a knot, which is called a chonmage. But it wasn't always the case. But what's interesting to say about that is that if you look at these scenes, you'll see that some samurai do have a shaved head at the top of the head, others don't. They're just sporting a full head of hair. And also, some samurai have a beard, some don't, a clean shaven. Why is that? Well, you probably have this idea that samurai all had to have a clean shaven face, but that is actually something that hasn't always been the case. So from the 12th century all the way up to the 16th century, a beard was considered manly, and in fact a sign of prestige. And this is why very important people such as Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, Tokugawa, they're all sporting beards in the iconography. Although then again, Hideyoshi's was a fake. However, as we reach the Edo period, so slightly after the setting of this show, having a beard is seen as a sign of resistance against the newly established order. So the samurai start shaving, whereas Ronin don't. And that's also a similar situation when it comes to the head of hair. Ronin just let their hair grow without shaving the pate. In fact, a law will eventually come into place that forbade Ronin, so masterless samurai, from shaving the top of their head as a way to make them easily recognizable, which is also one of the reasons why often in manga and anime, Ronin do not have a shaved top of the head, accurate. Between 1615 and 1623, the Bakufu proclaimed several written laws on customs concerning hairstyles and facial hair practices. In 1645, they prohibit full beards. 1660 is the date when the yakohige, or the mustache, become illegal. A full head of hair also becomes illegal, and the shaved pate or top of the head is now mandatory for all samurai. Not to mention, this law had to be repeated several times, which sort of indicates that at first maybe not everyone followed it, but eventually they will. The samurai class will have the shaved top. And then, between 1664 and 1680s, this idea of having to clean shave will be extended to the populace entirely. But in general, it is by 1630s that we see that samurai mostly are now clean-shaven with a shaved top, so considering the fact that this show is set in 1600 instead, it's absolutely accurate that some samurai still have a beard, some don't, and also samurai sometimes just keep the full head of hair. Very well made. Now let's look at the way they are sitting, and I've already touched briefly upon this on my trailer reaction, but I want to go a bit more deeply when it comes to this. So normally when we imagine today the way a Japanese sits, we think of the so-called seiza, so when they basically sit on their heels, kind of kneel down and then sit on their heels. This is the way that eventually the government will push as the correct way a Japanese sits. But in this period, and then even before, it wasn't still enforced nor pushed as much. So we do, when we look at iconography, see people that do sit in seiza, so it's not wrong to have a few people sitting this way. But when it comes to the very important members of sort of upper echelon of society, note how they are all sitting cross-legged. In Japanese that's called agura o kaku, and it's absolutely correct because that's how they would sit in the majority of cases when it comes to the bushi. The only exception would be some of their retainers, as we see in this scene, that adopt once again a third way of sitting, which is one knee, usually the left is on the floor, and then the right foot is on the floor. Kind of a half sitting, half kneeling position. This is typical of a retainer or a warrior, because it's a position where you are sitting, but you're also ready. And note that normally the right knee would be sort of up, because if you need to quick draw, because someone is attacking your lord and you need to be able to defend him, well, your sword and saya, so the scabbard, are always on the left. This is why usually Japanese, even to this day, whenever they stand up, they always stand up with the right knee first. Because if you stand up with the left knee first and you need to draw, you could block your sword. And it is fantastic to see this in the show. The way they sit represents a whole society whereby the lord can relax, but his retainers, they're always ready. Okay, I'd like now to take a moment to discuss firearms before we go into cannons. Cannons will be later on. But in general, one thing that both the 1980s version and the 2024 version do is that they show a lot of ashigaru and samurai wielding and wearing guns, so arquebuses. Now, in the book, the word musket is used more than 80 times, if I recall correctly. But unfortunately, in chapter 3, the book says something that it was a myth, and it's something that now we know is completely incorrect, and I do have to point that out. And I'm very happy that they don't do that and don't represent that in the shows, both of them. As you read chapter 3, you'll see that the book pushes this idea that firearms were seen as dishonorable by the Japanese, and samurai didn't want to use them because they were afraid that the ghosts of their ancestors would think that, oh, you're so dishonorable, why would you use a gun? But that is completely wrong. In fact, so much so that we know not only that the moment the Portuguese introduced arquebuses and firearms to the Japanese, they immediately wanted to learn how to make them, but we know they mass-produced them and they equipped their armies. Now, when it comes to how many gunners you should have, now don't quote me on this, but I remember that depending on the army, there will be a rough ratio of 1:4 or 1:5 with archers, in the sense that for every gunner you deploy, you want 4 archers. But then again, it will depend on what army we're talking about. Some would heavily rely on cavalry, others would definitely adopt full force the gunners into their armies. But the fact that the show luckily shows soldiers wearing the matchlock type arquebuses is fantastic, because that's exactly what happened. The samurai saw it as a new weapon that could give them the edge in battle, and they absolutely adopted it. There is nothing, neither within honor or any code like Bushido, which is not even period anyways, nothing says that they can't use a weapon that works against their opponents. And the idea that the katana is the most honorable weapon, as he's saying, is something that is pushed once again later, but definitely not in the Sengoku period, where the samurai would use bows, they would use naginata, they would use yari, spears, and of course, as we said, cannons and gunfire. Okay, so now we get into a part where we need to really go deeper into Japanese culture of the period. We see that we have this servant who gets mad because of the exchange of kind of political nonsense between Ishido, who is based on Ishida, I know, a character, kind of the main villain. He's one of the 4 or 5 regions, and then Toranaga, so Tokugawa, and he gets upset, he stands up and threatens because he almost entirely draws his sword, and then because of the dishonor that this causes, he asks permission to commit what is called Sepuku, which is a form of ritual, offing yourself. I can't use the word on YouTube. This scene is present in the book, so this is a very faithful representation, in fact, of what we see. And the word seppuku in the book appears 91 times, so it was definitely something that the author really wanted to convey to the Western audience that was reading about the Japanese and their customs. But how bad is it that he almost drew, basically showed his blade in front of these important people? Well, there is a law within Japanese society that made drawing your weapon in official buildings, specifically when you had emissaries of the shogun, punishable to death. So by doing that, by drawing and showing his blade, he's already dead. And he would know that, all Bushi would know this, so it's kind of weird already that he's doing that because he knows what he's done. So the fact that afterwards he realizes and he's like, oh, I offer to commit seppuku and kill his own family and his lineage and all that, it's, well, you knew that would have happened. So it's kind of weird, but I understand why they write it like that. They write it because it creates tension, and it's a good way to introduce the concept of seppuku, specifically the one in order to remedy a mistake, which is the second type. You'll see there are a lot of different types. And when I say that there are many different types, I mean that fundamentally there are two different kinds. There is one that is called jijin, which is self-destruction, voluntary, and then there is another type, which is when you are told that you have to perform seppuku, usually by the authorities. Of course, in this case, it would be the first, but even within this specific umbrella term, there are lots of different kinds. As you can see in this table here, you'll find a link to the article in the description. In this specific case, as we look at this list, what he's doing is number 2, inseki, assuming responsibility for mistakes. If you have watched The Last Samurai, you are familiar with the first, number 1, which is whenever you lost a battle to avoid becoming a prisoner, you would commit seppuku. That's shown in that movie. And it's something that happened very often in the 13th century due to the exchange and war with the Mongols. Number 6, so junshi, becomes more common in the Edo period, so not yet. For example, not only in the form of, oh, I want to follow my lord, my daimyo, into the grave, which became so much of a problem that they had to actually make it illegal by law, but also in situations such as when it was commanded as a punishment, which again, it's something that happens in the period after this. So the whole scene is historically correct. The only thing that I'm a little weirded about is the fact that he also volunteers to end his family line. It's not that this never happened. It does happen. If you are familiar with the historical account of the 47 Ronin, where the historical Lord Asano of Bansho Ako had to commit seppuku ordered by the Bakufu precisely because he drew a sword while an official from Edo had arrived. So something was absolutely like, you can't do that. And then he had to end his entire family line, and then the Ronin decide to take revenge. It's a very interesting story. But yes, it did happen. But in this case, I think it's a little weird that he offered his son as well. I think he should have just offered himself. It would have been more realistic as a way to avoid the repercussions of his own actions to end into the head of his own family. So back to the list, still number 6, but the one that is called shohara, for the future benefit of one's posterity. That's the one I would have chosen if I wrote the book, but then again, just a little nitpick. Now I'd like to spend a moment to talk about the part where we have the first encounter with the Jesuit priests, so the missionaries that were taking care of spreading the church and building churches and Christianizing the Japanese and that sort of situation. So the Jesuits on the 1980s version are always represented wearing orange robes, whereas the Jesuits in the 2024 version are instead wearing the black robes that we are usually familiar with when we imagine this specific monastic order. Well, the attire for a Jesuit was fundamental to his persona. As we read from the records of St. Andrews, we learn that a novice in the 16th century and in the 17th century was not to touch the floor with his foot in the morning when he woke up unless he was already wearing his habit. But what we see, the orange clothes that appear in the 1980s version, are based specifically on the Jesuit Francis Xavier. Xavier reached Japan on the 27th of July 1549, and since then, Jesuits had worn the orange silk robes of the Buddhist priests, in the same color of the Buddhist priests. And the reason why is because Japanese reviled anyone with a poor appearance, and as long as they wore their typical black cassocks, the Jesuits found it difficult to be taken seriously. Thus, Xavier decided that him and his fellow workers would wear orange. And this worked perfectly in the sense that since then, as they started wearing orange, the people actually were taking them seriously and the proselyting was working really well, at least until the 1570s with the arrival of another Jesuit called Cabral, who will say, no, you're not supposed to wear these, this is the color of Satan, you need to wear the black robes. So it's not that one show is doing it wrong and one show is doing it right. I personally really like the idea of showing the orange robes. Maybe something I would have done in the 2024 version would have been to perhaps show 1 or 2 Jesuits wearing the orange, and maybe one of the upper Jesuits in command wearing black, telling them off, telling them, hey, you stop doing that. It would have been interesting from an educational perspective to talk about something that actually did happen. But I think the reason why they didn't do that in the 2024 show is because they went for a specific color palette and filters. And if you look at the show, everything looks pretty gloomy, dark, with this sort of cold colors in place when it comes to the filters. It's a choice, and therefore if you put someone wearing orange, it would have been a contrast. A contrast I like, but maybe they didn't want to. Which is why, in this case, I prefer the 1980s version once again, because in there, we do see the Jesuits wearing orange, but we also see some of them wearing the typical black attire, which would have been reasonable for the time. And this is where we get to the part that I'm going to criticize a bit more. The exchange between the Portuguese Catholic priest and John Blackthorne, who is clearly a Protestant. So Blackthorne asks, "Who are you?" And the priest responds, "A servant of God." And so Blackthorne to that says, "Your God? Make that distinction." It's true that a strong distinction would have been made between Catholics and Protestants in period, but I feel this show goes too far with it. Now, given, if you read the official church documents from period papal consistories, ecumenical councils such as the Council of Trent, the Exsurge Domine, you'll notice that Catholic, papal and general church authorities will refer to Protestants as heretics, and I myself have witnessed that when I went and was admitted into the secret Vatican archives in the Vatican, of course, in Italy many years ago, and they showed me a period copy of the original excommunication bull that was sent to Martin Luther. I say a copy because, of course, the original he destroyed, but I did see it. I read it. I saw the original, and yes, they weren't nice when Catholics talked about Protestants. With that being said, the distinction, your God, not my God, is kind of weird. And this even gets more anachronistic when, since he sees that the priest Portuguese priest is not actually honestly translating his words, as a way to try and represent the fact that he's not a Protestant, Blackthorne takes the cross from the priest, throws it on the floor, and stomps on it. Now let me make this one clear. No Christian, doesn't matter if it's Catholic or Protestant, would ever stomp on a cross. Not now, not then. And there is a reason why I call this action anachronistic rather than inaccurate. The reason why I say anachronistic is because it will happen if you look at the history in the near future when it comes to the history of the fumie. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with this, but as the Tokugawa regime takes hold, one of the things that happens is that there is a rebellion, specifically the Shimabara rebellion, which is a Christian-led rebellion in 1637. After that, and because of that, an already tense situation since the 1620s becomes completely unbearable, in the sense that already in 1620s, Japanese authorities and the Bakufu were trying to find a way to get rid of the Christians, and there would be an entire persecution whereby to find and root out Christian believers within the Japanese population, they will take these fumie, which were images of Christ or Mary, and they would force people, as we see in iconography, to stomp on it. And of course, Christians would refuse to do it, including Japanese Christians, and they would be tortured and executed. Although not all Christians actually refused to do it, some did it, and they are called kakure Christian, in the sense of hidden Christians, and they are the ones that most likely preserved Christianity within Japan, because what they would do is that they would stomp it because they were afraid of being killed, but then they would, go home and pray for forgiveness. But regardless of all that, it kind of reminds me of that, which is too early to see. A little note on this image here, they translate hire as an insult, but it's more correctly translated as impoliteness. And to be honest, to be impolite in Japanese society is an insult anyways, so can't really complain, can I? Note in this shot how the Japanese are amazed at the size of the European ships, and that is absolutely correct in the sense that European technology, specifically naval technology of the time, was far more advanced than anything they had in Japan. So when they would see the European vessels, absolutely they would have been astonished. All right, let's talk about Portuguese, shall we? So in this scene, the samurais is trying to communicate with the Europeans. In this case, I think when it comes to the ships, they are Dutch ships, and I think only 3 people were English. Everyone else would have been Dutch. So they're trying to communicate with the Dutch and the English pilot, and at first they speak Japanese to them, which is kind of weird. I don't think that that would actually happen as someone who has experience with international multilingual communication. Usually you want to organize a translator first, but regardless of this little nitpick, notice how in the movie they say they're using Portuguese, but they end up speaking English. Now, I've seen people complaining about this, the fact that the Japanese do speak Japanese, but when the Europeans are supposed to be speaking Portuguese, they are instead using English. But I do understand why they did that, so I don't have a problem with it. Me, as the foreign languages lover and obsessed person that I am, I would have loved it to have the Japanese speak Japanese, the English, maybe when the English speaks with the Dutch, he's using English, but then when he speaks to the Japanese, yeah, let him speak actual Portuguese, or with the Portuguese Jesuit priests. I would have loved it. But then again, I don't really count, because when I watch the movie and the people speak Japanese, I don't need to read the subtitles because I do understand Japanese, which means that what's really important is not me, but it's the audience en masse, and the audience en masse would be too tired, I think, of having to constantly read subtitles, both for Portuguese and for Japanese. So I understand why they made this choice. Just keep in mind that when they're speaking English, they're actually using Portuguese. You gotta use your imagination there. Okay, so as he reaches the shore, there is this scene, one of those scenes that I think they rendered better in the 1980s version than they did in the 2024, which is the scene of this Christian Japanese who gets excited and wants to talk, kind of does the sign of the cross because he's excited of being able to contact a Western Christian, but then a samurai in question gets annoyed and beheads him. There is a lot to unpack in this scene, and the way they did it in the 2024 version, I'm not a huge fan. So first of all, how true is it that a samurai could just cut down and kill anyone in the populace with no consequences? Well, there is a word that you must have heard if you're into Japanese history, which is kiriste gomen, which means to cut and leave someone dead, like the right that the samurai or the bushi had to cut someone because they felt insulted. This is not a period word, first of all, it's a modern Japanese word, retro applied to the Japanese period, but it is true that the samurai class and in general the bushi had this sort of legal right, if they felt offended or insulted, to cut down anyone who was below them in the societal hierarchy or structure in Japan. With that being said, not without consequences. So, if you were an extremely powerful warlord, a daimyo, or someone like really high, then yeah, you could have anyone executed and no one is gonna look into that. But if you are just a bushi, if you're just a samurai and you start cutting people down, it would be a problem, because the law stated that after you defended your honor against, for example, a villager that offended you and you cut him down, you need to report it to the authorities. You need to stay home for 20 days and you need to give the homicidal weapon, in this case your sword, to the authorities, and an investigation will begin, and you had to bring witnesses with you. You had to have people, well, if you had retainers they would, but you had to have witnesses, because if you didn't, you could be forced to commit seppuku. So I don't want you to watch this scene and think, oh, all samurai could just cut anyone down with no consequences. No, it's only really the upper echelon that could do that, and all the rest of the bushi, they had to be careful how you used that right. But the one thing that kind of annoys me about this scene is that after he beheads the peasant, he takes the bloody blade and resheaths it in this very good looking way and puts it back in the scabbard. That only happens in the 2024 version. He doesn't do it in the 1980s version, which is why I'm gonna praise the 1980s version over the 2024 one, because no samurai would do that. We know for a fact what he's doing in this scene is called chiburi, and it's kind of an Edo period and then late modern ritualistic representation of the idea of, I killed someone, now I've got blood on my blade, and I do a very ritualized move, either this, or if it's Katori Shintoryu, you just flip it like this, to get rid of the blood. But that didn't work. Like, this is important to underline. It doesn't work. If you have a blood on your blade, which you do if you have beheaded someone, and you do this, the blood doesn't go away. You need to take a piece of cloth and wipe it off, which is what period samurai would have done absolutely before putting the blade back into the scabbard, because if you put the bloody blade, seems like I'm cursing at the blade, if you put the bloody blade, after you do this, back into the scabbard, it will rust. So the fact that they do that in 2024 It looks cool, but yeah, I've got to give it to the 1980s version because it doesn't do it. Also, the face that Mr. Chamberlain, so Blackthorn, makes when he sees the beheading is priceless. In the 1980s, I love it. Just for that one. Alright, let's discuss this word, barbarian. So you'll notice that this is how they refer to Blackthorn, John Blackthorn. They call him the barbarian. I'd like to underline though that if you pay attention to the actual Japanese words spoken, they use two different words. They use the word banjin and then they use the word ijin. And yes, they can both be translated as barbarian. I'm not saying that the translation is incorrect, but specifically these words can mean a savage sometimes, and other times they were used specifically just to mean foreigners or someone from the West specifically. Alright, let's talk cannons. Okay, so this Dutch ship contained 20 cannons. Is that a lot? What kind of mid-tier? A little bit on the lower end, in fact, because there were other very famous ships, for example the Mary Rose from the 16th century that had all the way up to 90, more than 90 cannons. I do have to underline though that when I say cannons, I'm using it not in a technical sense, I'm using it in a looser sense, because in reality when you say cannon in period, you're only referring to a specific subtype or class of artillery, and there are lots of different words. So when I'm saying that they had 90 cannons, I'm also including falcons, falconets, bombards and all sorts of types of artillery. But yeah, 20 is not that much for a European ship at the time, but yeah, it's still 20 cannons. Are the cannons we see accurate? Well, for what I can see, they do look like period cannons, particularly if you see it has this sort of cylinder shape and then it has a little bump and then it continues a little bit, and that is absolutely one of the many different types of muzzles. And talking about muzzles, by the looks of it, I'd say these are muzzle loaders rather than breech loader types. Now, are they made of iron or not? Well, a lot of cannons would have been made of wrought iron, other cannons would have been made of cast iron, and other cannons would have been made of bronze. In fact, in the 16th and early 17th century, bronze becomes more typical. In this case, by the looks of it, the cannons, they are probably the lighter ones that are on top of the ship, they appear to be made of iron, but as they take bigger cannons, I can see that they are very heavily decorated in a very Renaissance way. Usually when they are that decorated, it's gonna be bronze. So I'm going to say if they're doing it historically, it would be both iron and bronze, with the heavily decorated ones being the bronze ones. Alright, so we get to one of the most horrible scenes in this first episode, which is when they boil one of the poor Dutch guys alive. Was that something that people did? Yes, and we do have historical, it wasn't that common as a way of execution, but it did happen. But I would like to underline that it's not something that is solely happening in Japan. People did it in medieval Europe as well. We do have accounts of situations in which they did it in England, for example, I believe during the reign of Henry VIII, and it was specifically reserved for people that were poisoners, so people that created poisons and tried to murder other people, they would be boiled alive, and also people that were, for some reasons, counterfeiters, so they would create fake silver coins. For some reasons, that would get you boiled alive too. There is in fact a very famous, I think the most famous account of someone being boiled alive within Japanese history is the case of the historical samurai Goemon. And if you watched the anime Lupin, then Gemon or Goemon was the same character. He's based on the historical one, at least for the name. And we do have this iconography here that shows when he was being boiled alive together with his son, how he's trying to hold the infant son to save him, but then that doesn't work, and so he ends up drowning him. It's a horrible situation, but yes, they did it. Long story short, yes, it did happen. I do see a difference, however, between the way the book describes the scene and the way the show represents the scene. In the sense that in the show, we are left with this feeling that, oh my gosh, the Japanese, they all look like sociopaths. Like, they do this, nobody cares. They just boil a human alive and no one really thinks anything of it. But in reality, the book tells us that everyone except for the actual person that did it pushed him in, and the person who ordered it, so the Yabu, I think, is the samurai in this case, so the two sociopaths, everyone else thinks it's a horrible thing, both the Europeans and the Japanese. So the book kind of does that, which I think is more realistic. Now, since we mentioned firearms, I'd like to also mention the fact that we see a few pistols in this show, including the first episode. But the problem with the pistols that we see is that they are in fact the incorrect model. These are pistols that are at least 100 years too futuristic. But I do have to underline that this is something that I didn't see first, and I'm in fact quoting Matt Easton from Schola Gladiatoria. He said it first, so credit where credit is due. And In his comments, Mr. Ferguson tells us the exact model that we are seeing and therefore why it's too late of a pistol to be wielded by both John Blackthorne in the 1600s and of course William Adams. And I do trust Mr. Ferguson's expertise, so I'm not going to double check on this as I usually do because he's the firearm expert at the Royal Armory. So massive thank you to Mr. Ferguson for that. Thank you so much, and do go check out the Royal Armory's YouTube channel. You'll find a link in the description. Who were the Kunoichi? Did female ninja or assassins really exist in feudal Japan? How did crime and punishment work for both the samurai and the common people? Who were the Christian lords in feudal Japan and why did they convert? We'll answer these questions and many more on today's review of Shogun Episode 2. As always, I would like to start by saying that even though this is a review for historical accuracy, we always want to keep in mind that this TV series, which is a remake of the original from the 1980s, which was awesome by the way, is not necessarily based on 100% history, but it's based on the homonymous novel written by James Clavell, which is a fictionalized telling or retell of actual historical events. Therefore, a certain level of drift from historical accuracy is fine and can be expected. With that being said, just to remind you, let's remember that we are in the year 1600, so we are at the end of the Sengoku period, almost at the beginning of the Edo Jidai. Already right off the bat I want to say that one thing I really like about episode 2 is that we see a lot of close-ups and shots of samurai armor, and I mean, look at me. That kind of gave it 10 points already. From me, love it, because of course the armor is not only period accurate, but looks to be really high-end replicas. I really like it. Excellent. At the very beginning of this episode, one of the first scenes that we see is in this very formal, sort of sad situation where the overlord is about to die and therefore everyone is dressed in their most formal attire, and once again the costume department is doing a spectacular job. Now I want you to focus very briefly on the sort of hats that these noble gentlemen are wearing in this specific setting. What are those? What do they represent? And are they historically accurate? Well, hats have always been a means of representing your status in society in all sorts of cultures throughout the world, and in a way they extended this distinctive function also onto helmets for the warrior classes, such is the case with the tate eboshi type of hat, which then is recreated in helmet form. Just as one example, in feudal Japan the upper echelon of society had all sorts of different types of headwear they could use, from which can be generally described with the umbrella term eboshi. For example, you have soft version, stiff version, and you also have the kazaori eboshi, which sometimes is used by lower ranking jige. But headwear goes all the way up to the sumptuous kanmuri, the classic court cap. In this case we do definitely have a type of eboshi. Generally they were made of cloth, at least initially, but later versions can be lacquered paper, even leather, and in this case I think this will be a ori eboshi, which is basically a folded version of the nae eboshi, mostly used specifically by samurai. After being folded they would be lacquered into position so that their shape would remain the same. Very well done. On the next shot I'd like to point your attention to something that I've already discussed on the first episode, so the review of episode 1, but I just want to briefly touch upon it. Look at the way they're all sitting. So the aristocrats, the very important people, the people with power, are all sitting down with their legs crossed. So this is something in Japanese you call agura o kaku, and that is absolutely correct. The idea that everyone has to sit in seiza, so basically on your knees and then sitting on your heels, even though it's something that is very common today in Japan, and that is the so-called correct way for the Japanese to sit, and it's pretty much ubiquitous now in Japan everywhere you go, men, women, upper class, lower class. In feudal Japan, particularly in this time, so before the Edo government actually pushed it as the way a Japanese sits, it would have been done to sit in seiza, but it wouldn't have been as spread or common, and in fact a lot of bushi, members of the buke class, samurai aristocracy would have instead, if they are upper class or the upper echelon, they would sit in this way instead, and that's what we see in iconography. Now, you will notice that one of the samurai is sitting in seiza in the background, but I don't mind if it's the occasional samurai sitting that way or the occasional maid sitting that way, because we do find them once again occasionally in iconography, but it's great that they are sitting with their legs crossed because there is absolutely a recreation of period iconography and I love it. Now there is the introduction of the different types of Christianity that are explained to Lord Toranaga, whom at this time isn't familiar with, and this is absolutely plausible and probable. It's very likely that at first Christianity would have just been considered the religion of the West, but of course as interactions with other powers such as England, such as Holland occurred, then an explanation was due. But this wouldn't have been a difficult concept to understand for the Japanese necessarily, because even though this is one thing that I kind of critique a little bit of this scene here, because note how John Blackthorne is talking about the fact that in the West you have Protestants and Catholics, and they are different. They're both Christians, but they basically hate each other, and they of course have different doctrinal beliefs. Now, Lord Toranaga reacts with a little bit of surprise to this, and he says, but both believe Jesus is God? Question mark. Well, this it's kind of strange for me, because at the end of the day, it's not like you have one sect of Buddhism. You have loads of different varieties of Buddhism. Even the versions of Buddhism that the Japanese have in Japan at this time, which of course is imported through Korea, are different to some of the versions of Buddhism that are still prevalent in China. They were aware of the fact that within a religion you can have many different varieties. So the fact that he thinks, so you're different types of Christianity, but you both believe in Jesus as God, this shouldn't be strange nor a difficult concept to understand or to grasp for a Japanese of the period. In fact, this also allows us to enter a different discussion, which is that of syncretism. Now, what syncretism is within the concept of religion, syncretism is the amalgamation or attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. Therefore, syncretism as a definition is the blending or combination of different religious beliefs and practices, and it has been a prominent feature of Japanese religious life throughout history. The two main religions in Japan, Shinto and Buddhism, or Shinto and Bukkyo, have coexisted and intermingled for centuries, along with other religious influences such as Taoism and Confucianism. For instance, we see this as the ability to incorporate various pantheons into one frame of worship, which illustrates a sort of multidimensionality of worship which would have been absolutely the norm in Japan during this period. Religious syncretism tends to happen historically organically and naturally when there is cultural proximity, but it can be enforced and manipulated through governmental interaction and mandates. In Japan, both things happen. We could in fact say that Shinto and Buddhism have heavily influenced each other since the 6th century. Many Buddhist temples were built adjacent to Shinto shrines, and deities from both religions were often worshipped together. At one point, this syncretism was so pervasive that until the Meiji period, many Japanese people did not even distinguish between the two religions. And this is, I think, an excellent point to now introduce the Honji Suijaku theory. This is a theory which emerged in the 9th century, which posits that Shinto kami, or the deities, we could say the spirits of nature, are indeed manifestations of Buddhist bodhisattva and Buddhas. This, in fact, allowed for an integration of Shinto deities into Buddhist pantheon and vice versa. And to sort of connect back to what I mentioned briefly, in this sort of syncretism started to happen also within Christianity and Shinto and Buddhism. In fact, in order for the Japanese to really understand who Mary was, for example, they would connect her to a Buddhist bodhisattva canon. So all of this to say, it's an interesting scene because on one side we could critique it and say, yeah, of course it would be familiar with the idea that there are multiple versions of one religion and different sects, and sometimes these sects fight each other. Absolutely happened in Japan. On the other hand, though, perhaps he is a follower of both Shinto and Buddhism and therefore doesn't fully understand, well, why can't you just get along? At the end of the day, isn't it the same deity, meaning Jesus? So I like it, I don't dislike it, but I just wanted to provide a little extra context. Let's continue. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Now move into a scene that I think can bring and provide some interesting things when it comes to everyday life of Japan at this time. So you'll notice that we are inside Mariko's house and she's talking with her kid, but then her husband, who is an absolute asshole by the way, he comes in, sits down, is all angry, complaining, and then they start eating. Now as they eat, they're using hashi, so the chopsticks. Now were chopstick a thing already in the Sengoku period? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, chopsticks had been around for a very long long time. Let me tell you a little bit about that. So chopsticks were introduced in Japan from China during the Nara period. The earliest chopsticks in Japan were used primarily for religious ceremonies and were not yet widely used as eating utensils. The widespread use of chopsticks as dining utensils in Japan began during the Heian period. During this time, Chinese customs, including the use of chopsticks, became more prevalent among the Japanese aristocracy. Now, initially, chopsticks were considered a luxury item and were made from materials such as ivory or precious woods. Over time, chopsticks became more common and were made from more affordable materials like bamboo or lacquered wood. By the Edo period, chopsticks had become the primary eating utensils in Japan, and their use had spread to all social classes. Today, chopsticks are an integral part of Japanese dining culture and are used for a wide variety of dishes, from sushi, although then again sushi should be traditionally eaten by hand, but some people do use them, and noodles to traditional multi-course kaiseki meals. So, considering the fact that we are in 1600, people had already had plenty of time for chopsticks to be found in all sorts of homes, including the home of Mariko. Okay, this one is interesting because we have this, the kind of the villain of this story, one of the enemies of Lord Toranaga. He enters, and of course the Portuguese missionary, who is familiar with how brutal this man is and also xenophobic towards Europeans and in general foreigners, he immediately tells John Blackthorne, just don't say anything and bow if you care for your life. This is an interesting statement because one of the reasons why he's saying that is not because this guy is a maniac and the moment you say something out of line, he's going to kill you. That's not the idea. I think what this scene is trying to underline is the complex and intricate political interplay of the current situation in Japan at the end of the Sengoku period. So in other words, if any of these foreigners said something that could be used against Lord Toranaga, then that would have had them killed. So in other words, you have to be careful at the end of the Sengoku period of anything you say if you are a man in power, and that is what this scene is trying to convey, which I think does really well. Now, interestingly enough, as I say, this feudal lord here, he's very differently from Lord Toranaga, so Tokugawa, who was very interested in the West. He was fascinated by Western religion. He was fascinated by anything Western. He liked European armor. He gave the missionaries land and permission to build their churches in the Western style. So he was very open towards foreign people, but this man instead is sort of a representation of the other, more common side of Japan at this time, which was a very xenophobic and anti-foreign mental attitude. And in fact, one of the things he says, he starts insulting the looks of both John Blackthorne and I believe indirectly the Portuguese monk. And he says how ugly, he says with a dog's face. Now this is absolutely coherent. We do have some situations in which I would imagine some Japanese, perhaps in the population, they would have looked at Europeans and even Africans, for the few Africans that reached Japan at this time, and they would have thought, wow, how odd. Maybe even not necessarily in a negative way, but also like because of the stature, the color of the hair or the color of the skin. But when it comes to people like him, then yes, there were people that thought that, for example, Europeans were demons. They called us Oni. So depending on what Japanese you're meeting, someone like Oda Nobunaga or someone like Tokugawa Ieyasu, they would have been in favor of Western people, at least at the beginning. But when it comes to someone like him, they would focus on the looks. For example, the fact that we have bigger noses compared to the Japanese, and that was matched with some types of Oni and demons, such as the Tenno, just to say one. Yeah, the freak from the West is how he refers to them. Okay, so now we are inside another one of these informal meetings where they talk about politics basically, and then we have the mention of the Christian regents or the Christian lords. This may come as a surprise if you have never really studied Japanese history of this period, but indeed not only Christianity spread among the population in the sense that they started having common people joining the new Western religion, but in fact some of the powerful daimyo, so the lords, the feudal lords who were part of the military leading elite of Japan, did convert to Christianity. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about this, like who were these Christian lords, why did they convert, what were the advantages for someone in Japan at this time to accept the new religion from not only a strategic sense but also from an economic standpoint. So let me tell you about that. During the feudal period in Japan, several daimyo converted to Christianity, particularly during the latter half of the 16th century. Some notable Christian daimyo include Omura Sumitada, who was baptized in 1563, granting the Jesuits the port of Nagasaki in 1580, Arima Harunobu, who was baptized baptized in 1579 and was a powerful supporter of the Jesuits, helping establish the Arima Christian domain in Kyushu. Otomo Sorin, who was baptized in 1578 and became known as Don Francisco, allowing the Jesuits to establish a mission in his domain. Konishi Yukinaga, who fought in the Korean campaigns under Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He was executed after the Battle of Sekigahara for supporting the losing side. Kuroda Yoshitaka, and there are more. These Christian daimyo played significant roles in the propagation and protection of Christianity in Japan during the late 16th century. However, as the Tokugawa shogunate consolidated power and adopted an increasingly isolationist policy, Christianity came to be seen as a threat to national stability and security, and many of these Christian daimyos faced persecution as a result of their faith. But now let's discuss how and why they joined the Christian church and whether it was, in fact, a matter of faith. So, of course, whenever we talk conversion, we shouldn't completely disregard the idea of a spiritual and philosophical appeal. It's possible that at least some, maybe a minority of these daimyo, were in fact drawn to the spiritual and philosophical teachings of Christianity, which could have been compatible with at least some of their own beliefs and values. But of course, I think one of the main aspects of conversion when it comes to people in power is the political and economic advantages. Converting to Christianity could provide daimyo with access to European trade, technology, and weapons. The Portuguese in particular favored Christian daimyo and often provided them with support and resources. In some cases, also a personal relationship with missionaries may have played a role in the conversion of some of the early daimyo. In other words, these relationships could be based on friendship, loyalty, or strategic alliances. And of course, as we mentioned, syncretism. The idea is that some daimyo would find it very possible to blend Christian teachings with their traditional Japanese rigorous religious beliefs. In other words, from the point of view of some of these daimyo, it's not that by accepting Christianity you now have to stop being a Shinto practitioner or a Buddhist. In fact, they might have thought, I'll just add one god to the 8,000 I already worship. The Jesuits wouldn't really support that idea, but, if you keep it to yourself. It's interesting how this concept that I've just mentioned is underlined in the show, because as they are showing Kiyama, who is one of these Christian lords, they tell us a man whose faith in Christ is guided only by his greed and ambition. Very plausible. In the next scene, which I find to be absolutely beautiful from an artistic perspective, we see that we have some probably low-level retainers that are walking around the complex, the castle complex, and as they enter the inside of this complex, we see that when they are indoors, they are always wearing short swords. Now, I really like that because there is a touch of authenticity, and that's something that we saw happen clearly in the first episode as well, when Toranaga, as he enters the Osaka Joes or Osaka castles, he literally removes his longsword, so the katana, gives it to the retainers, but maintains his short sword. This was absolutely the thing to do as a samurai, whether you be low ranking or upper echelon. As you enter the premises of any home, whether it be a friend, whether it be a local authority, or the rooms in a castle, you wouldn't just walk around with your longsword, so the katana. That is because as you do that, you might bump into things, you might hit the vase. It would be looked and considered rude, so you would remove and give your weapon away. But a samurai, once again low ranking or high ranking, is never to be found weaponless, because of course if someone tries to mess with you, you need to have access to a personal protection device such as a sword, and therefore they would keep the wakizashi, which is the shorter version of the katana, or sometimes they would choose to just keep the tanto, which is basically a dagger. I love that they represented this and we don't see just a bunch of samurai walking around in full battle armor, maybe like a yari. Like, that would have been so weird unless they are there placed specifically as guards, but even then full battlefield gear would have been kind of strange. Now we get to a scene that I think is also significant when it comes to something that you might have missed if you don't exactly know what was happening at this time in Japan. As you know, John Blackthorne is imprisoned, and at this time Lord Toranaga is doing it because he doesn't want his opponent, his political opponent, to know that he in fact likes John Blackthorne, and he really wants him to tell him as much as possible about Western powers, which is in fact this lengthy conversation that they will have in the latter part of the episode, which is absolutely coherent with historical, and I'll tell you more about that. But in this scene we see that Blackthorne is imprisoned, and then we see that there is an execution. I'll tell you about the execution in a second, but right now I want to focus on the other monk who I believe is a Protestant, the other Protestant vicar, whatever you want to call him, the guy with the long beard. And as they're talking, the monk tells him, you're gonna die here, and perhaps you'll be put on the cross. And John Blackthorne says, I didn't travel all this way to be put on a cross. But how realistic is it as a way to kill Christians in this specific time period, to in fact crucify them? Well, it is absolutely realistic because it's something that did happen in Japan. Now, given the full-on persecution of Christians and martyrdom of Christians from the central government still hasn't happened yet, but a initial clash with some Christians in some areas of Japan had already happened. In fact, to be specific, a crucifixion of Christians had happened in 1597, so 3 years before the events taking place in this specific show. What this means is that even though it was a very recent deed, the expectation that this monk has, oh, they are gonna crucify us, is absolutely plausible and period accurate, because even though this would have been already kind of a shock and a recent development, it was one of the dangers that Christians in this specific time period in Japan knew they were facing. Now, how did the Portuguese authorities, because we see that Portuguese are still here, they are still dealing and talking with the daimyo, and yet some Christians had been crucified. Well, how did the Portuguese authorities react to that? Well, the arrested Christians in 1597 were forced to march from Kyoto to Nagasaki, a journey of approximately 600 kilometers or 370 miles. Then in Nagasaki, they were crucified on a hill on February 5th, 1597. This event is known as the 26 Martyrs of Japan and is considered a significant moment in the history of Christianity in Japan. The martyrs were canonized by the Catholic Church in 1862, and their story has become an important part of the narrative of early Christian persecutions in Japan. The Portuguese authorities in period, who had established a trading presence in Japan and were instrumental in introducing Christianity to the country, were deeply concerned by the persecution and crucifixion of some Christians in Japan. After the martyrdom of the 26 Martyrs of Japan, the Portuguese Jesuit missionary Luis Cerqueira, who was the Bishop of Japan at that time, sent a report to the Portuguese King Philip II, who was also the King of Spain due to the Iberian Union. In his report, Cerqueira describes the event leading up to the crucifixion and the bravery displayed by the martyrs. The Portuguese authorities, both religious and political, saw the persecution of Christians as a threat to their interests in Japan. They feared that the actions of Toyotomi Hideyoshi specifically would lead to the expulsion of Portuguese traders and missionaries from Japan, which would be a significant blow to their influence in Asia. However, the Portuguese response was limited by several factors. 1. The distance between Europe and Japan made quick communication and action difficult. 2. The Portuguese authorities were aware of the delicate political situations in Japan and did not want to risk a complete breakdown of relationships. 3. The Iberian Union was already engaged in multiple conflicts around the world, including their conflicts with England, which limited their ability to respond forcefully to the event in Japan. So despite these limitations, the Portuguese continued to send missionaries to Japan, and the Catholic Church continued to recognize and venerate the martyrs. In other words, I think the way the Portuguese authorities, or in general the Western powers, saw this event was as a single event with a specific daimyo lord. They knew that some of the daimyo were strongly against Christianity, but they also knew that other daimyos were converting, and therefore that's why a lot of the missionaries were in fact sent to these areas where they were allowed and authorized to establish churches, because they also knew that they could have received protection. Because remember, at this time we do not have a fully unified Japan yet, and one of the characteristics of the Sengoku period is that you were always dealing with different feudal lords, and each lord had power, legal power, to make rules and establish the rule of law differently in his own domains. So we could consider these as different countries really, the different clans and their territories. Alright, so now in the next part we see that there is the execution of a man. We don't know much about him, we see that they're covering his face and then they behead him. I'd like to kind of open a little bracket into how crime and punishment worked in Japan in period, but one thing that I think we can understand here is that this man was most likely just a member of the common people, I don't think that this man is a samurai. One of the reasons is because unless a samurai or a retainer had done a crime that was considered so heinous that it wasn't given the possibility to commit seppuku or harakiri, in the majority of cases samurai would be allowed to do that, and therefore if we see an execution of a samurai, he would first off himself, and then in some cases he will be helped out with a beheading, not every time. But in this case we go directly to a beheading, so I believe it's a commoner that is being punished. Among commoners, the normal sentence for serious crimes was death by hanging, a punishment that was considered both defiling and degrading. Hanging shamed not only the convict, but also his or her entire family. Executions of commoners normally took place in public, like we see here, often followed by a display of the criminal's head or corpse as a warning to the rest of the population. As we were talking before, daimyo, many of whom considered their fiefdoms independent feudal states, were the ones to establish increasingly detailed codes of laws and appointing the loyal samurai retainers as magistrates. Samurai also ran the official organized justice system, which existed primarily to enforce the law among the lower social classes. These systems were based on an elaborate written code of law, the earliest of which were codified during the 7th century. Now, during this time specifically, so the Sengoku period and even the Heian period before, the magistrates and police appointed by the shogun were charged with enforcing these laws, arresting and sentencing criminals, and keeping the peace among the lower classes. Beneath these magistrates, the yoriki, or assistant magistrates, conducted investigations and supervised the doshin, whose function was similar to that of modern beat cops, if you will, who patrolled the cities, kept the peace, and made arrests when necessary. In addition to the pair of swords all samurai wore, the doshin carried a forked truncheon called ajite as a symbol of their rank. Magistrates would be normally chosen from powerful clans, assistant magistrates, and instead the, say, cops, so the police were usually drawn from low-ranked samurai families. The next thing I'd like to focus on is when John Blackthorne actually meets Lord Toranaga, and of course they are using, in order to communicate, an interpreter, and the interpreter happens to be the Jesuit priest. This is of course absolutely historically accurate, and it is also accurate that some Japanese, possibly in court, just like the lady who is sitting right next to Lord Toranaga, would have been studying Portuguese at the time, because Portuguese was indeed the language of communication with the West, at least towards the first interaction between Japan and Europe. Now, as a personal preference, I would have preferred that in these scenes the characters would be speaking Portuguese. I would have absolutely liked it more for immersion, but I do understand that for audience sake that might have been a little tough to endure, considering the fact that people already need to read subtitles for the Japanese parts. So I do understand from a technical standpoint why they chose to represent Portuguese in English, because yes, they're speaking English, we have to imagine them using Portuguese. Just as a personal preference, I would have liked to listen to actual Portuguese, and if it was medieval Portuguese, I mean, okay, but that's just me. Now, I'd like to point out one thing when it comes to how these people in the medieval period, and then late medieval period, early Renaissance, how they actually learned these languages, and we could really open a small discussion here, even all the way back to ancient Rome, where, as we know, the Romans would interact with a lot of people outside their frontiers, particularly when they were expanding forcefully into barbarian territory. How did they communicate? Now, of course, a lot would have had to do with people who were bilingual. That was in fact the first to-go rule when it came to the ancient period, because you have to imagine that whether it be the medieval period or the classical period, it would have been extremely more difficult, significantly orders of magnitude more difficult to become fluent in a language than it is today, because today we have dictionaries, we have the internet. It's so much easier to reach mastery in a foreign language than it would have been, for example, in the medieval period, particularly considering the fact that the interactions between Europe and Japan were very, very new. So just to touch upon this briefly, even though I covered it in details in my second channel, Metatrons Academy, if you want a full-on discussion on how this was done, but in general the idea is, first these missionaries would build a common vocabulary based on things that you can point to. So imagine that you point towards an object and then the person who speaks Japanese tells you how that object is pronounced or said in that language, and then you write it down and make a note and start creating a basic vocabulary for very basic interactions. Once you start creating a build-up of nouns, vocabulary, adjectives and verbs, which will create the infrastructure of your communicative experience with the Japanese as a Portuguese monk, then you'll have to find a way to introduce religious concepts, of course the basic ones, so crucifixion, Christ is God, the church, Holy Communion rather than the atonement of Jesus Christ. So the basis of religion in order to preach, since that was their mission or their duty from a papacy standpoint. Usually the way that was done was through connection to vocabulary that is religious and already existing in the local religions. Now we'll touch upon this later on because religion does become a factor in this episode, so I won't dive into it right now, but just suffice to say that after the first generations of interconnection and interaction between two different people, once you have someone who is born within that culture, but perhaps in a family that also speaks, say, Portuguese, you create a bilingual, and those will be the perfect interpreters, if you will. Of course, sometimes, particularly at the times of ancient Rome, this was done forcefully. They would take people from a barbarian village who are very young, who already speak the language, and then they would take them to Rome forcefully and bring them up for the next 10 years. Then you've got the perfect interpreter, if you will. And this was done as well in the medieval period, for example, in Central and South America with the conquistadors from Spain. So this was something that the European powers were already familiar with as they reached Japan. Then we have a wonderful shot once again of Lord Toranaga, and he has got his samurai armor in the background. Interesting how at the bottom we see the symbol, the clan symbol, which is the Tokugawa, because of course we know that Toranaga is indeed a fictionalized version of Tokugawa. I just find it funny that the symbol is indeed the Tokugawa family, because we are in front of Tokugawa Ieyasu in reality, even though it's a fictionalized version. And we see Mariko and the samurai now sitting in seiza on the side. Interestingly, as you can see, the samurai in this case, both Toranaga and this samurai, don't have a shaved forehead. As I've explained in the previous episode, not every samurai had a shaved forehead, and it very much depends on the period. In earlier times, long locks together with a beard would be considered manly and also, again, a distinction of the samurai class. But as we enter the Sengoku period, then the idea of shaving your head starts to become a thing, not necessarily always with the lords. I mean, for example, Oda Nobunaga would have had a completely shaved head, in fact, very, very shaved all the way up to the back, which is once again something that some samurai did. The looks of a samurai change over time. It's not a monolith. We always imagine the samurai to look a certain way, but in reality, even the fact that initially they had a beard, then a clean-shaven look is more coherent with the samurai class that happens in the Edo period. Things switch around. So this is absolutely fine. Okay, this is another screenshot I wanted to focus on because look at all of these torches and all of this fire inside this home. I believe this is the castle. In fact, it's not even a home, it's the castle. Now, wouldn't that be a fire hazard? I mean, if you think about it, differently from European castles, Japanese castles are primarily made of wood. Therefore, you can imagine that if something like this were to happen, like you have a lot of torches, a lot of fire all over the place, and one of these torches falls on the ground, and then the tatami catches fire, and then this fire goes onto the walls, couldn't that potentially destroy the entirety of the castle, save it for like the foundation walls, which we know are in fact made of stone, the ones that look a little bit like a fan? Well, I have a video in the making which is a comparison and distinction between Western castles and from an architectural and then also societal standpoint, as well as for military purposes, but also Japanese castles, architectural, societal discussion. But one thing I want to add, kind of mention here, and then you'll find all the details on that video which I'll publish soon, is the fact that one of the things that we have to consider about Japanese is that they did face the problem of what do we do if fire is applied onto our castles, and their solution, differently from the West where we decided, you know what, never mind wooden structures, just build them in stone. In the East, one thing they did is that they would cover the Japanese walls of these castles with plaster. Now, most of the times it's white, for example the Himeji-jo, very, very famous, but occasionally this will be black, but in the majority of cases it's white. Now, what's interesting and what's important to see is that even if a room in the castle were to catch fire, maybe under a siege or maybe because of an accident, that wouldn't mean that the entire structure would be now up in flames, simply because these plasters in fact offered not only a very high level of fire resistance because of the ingredients that they were made of. So whenever you see the Japanese castles are in fact painted, that's not just from an aesthetic standpoint, that too, but also to provide fire resistance, which the plaster does. We now reach one of my favorite scenes in the entire episode, which is the part of the attack of the bandits. So basically, John Blackthorne is being transported, probably for execution, but Toranaga doesn't want that to happen, so he sends one of his retainers with a bunch of samurai and some bandits to basically have this attack, have everyone killed, and sort of rescue John Blackthorne. I like this scene because I think, I like seeing a little bit of combat, and in fact that is the only thing that I kind of as a critique towards this show. I wish they put a bit more combat in it. Sometimes there are full-on episodes where not even a sword is drawn, and to me that's a little boring. The show is great, by the way. I really like the show. It's just that some episodes are more fun than others, and this is one of the fun ones. So this attack is interesting. It kind of represents exactly the sort of power play and subterfuge that would have happened during this period, because not only there is this whole, I pretend to arrest John Blackthorne, but then, a bunch of bandits attacked, but then I'm having the bandits killed, so I leave no loose ends. That's exactly the sort of climate that we are talking about in the Sengoku period, and that's important because it shows that really feudal Japan, the era of samurai, is not an era of honor, it's not an era of splendor and, righteousness, but it is an era of brutality. And yes, there was a code of honor, but the code of honor was always just focused towards your own lord, not towards your enemy in the majority of cases. I won't go deeply into this because I already talked about it in details. After this scene, we reach the scene where once again Blackthorne is brought in front of Toranaga, and this time they have this lengthy conversation where Blackthorne discusses and describes the political situation, but also the geographic situation in Europe. And of course Toranaga is interested because he understands the importance of having information when dealing with Western people, not only as a way to sort of control, but also manipulate his interactions, and also because he understands that indeed the West has a lot to bring to the table at this time, because they are technologically more advanced than the Japanese when it comes to warfare, with their cannons and their ships and their firearms, but also in general because, as we know, he is fascinated by the West. The only thing I'd like to say when it comes to historical accuracy is that even though this scene is relatively short, it's a lengthy conversation, but compared to the real one, this seems to happen within an afternoon. In reality, John Blackthorne, of course, is a fictional character, but he's based on William Adams. The interaction between the historical William Adams and Tokugawa Ieyasu when it comes to talking about the West would have lasted days, if not weeks. Just to give you a little perspective here. A lot of information was shared through the means of translators. I would like to now talk about this scene with the Kunoichi. So we see that there is an assassin. It's a woman, and she is, very stealthy, enters the premises and finds the room where Toranaga is, although he is sort of kind of waiting for her, and has a combat interaction, which I thought was great. She's clearly a Kunoichi. What is a Kunoichi? As I have explained already on this video, link in the description below, when I was talking about Assassin's Creed and their character Naoe, who is also a Kunoichi. Kunoichi are absolutely historical. They existed. Are they female ninja? Well, keep in mind that, of course, a lot of these terms that we use, such as the term ninja, wasn't used in period. It's kind of a later term. An agent would probably be a good way to translate it. Shinobi, whether they be male or female, did exist. There were espionage of feudal Japan. They were spies. They were saboteurs. They were infiltrators. They existed, and we do have mention of female ones, so the Kunoichi. Now, what's important to say though is that, as far as I am aware, we don't really have mentions of Kunoichi being trained in combat. That doesn't mean that it never happened, but definitely a Kunoichi should be considered as a infiltrator that was using the fact that they were probably beautiful, or perhaps had a position already within a specific castle, say as a maid, say as a courtesan, and utilized these positions of privilege to not only listen and spy, but sometimes to intervene. Of course, let's dispel the idea that Kunoichi and ninja and shinobi were trained assassins. They weren't, but some Kunoichi and some ninja were absolutely capable of assassinations, and we know that that occasionally happened. One thing that I would like to answer now as a question is, but why are they using a female ninja or a kunoichi? Why didn't they just use a male assassin? Well, the reason is that there are some possible advantages to using a female ninja in this case. For example, one of which would be the idea that in period she wouldn't have been perceived as a threat. With having all of those retainers and samurai in there, and very patriarchal society, if you will, in Japan, no one would have thought a courtesan or a maid, someone you don't think is trained in combat, someone who doesn't look like a possible threat, to be someone that you need to constantly look at and be like, oh, let's be careful. On the other hand, if you had one of those shinobi who were also samurai, because they absolutely existed, in fact, all the evidence we have for shinobi, the majority are part of the bushi class. If you see someone who's strong and trained in combat and battle hardened, you might want to be a little more careful who you allow him to be nearby. But if it's once again a woman, a lot of the mentality of the time would have been like, yeah, that's not a threat, not a problem. But of course, one thing we do realize always is once you give a bladed weapon to anyone, they will become a threat. On that note, however, it's interesting how we have before she actually gets stopped by Toranaga, and once again this is an assassination attempt at John Blackthorne, which sure, cool. Before she gets killed by Toranaga and sliced, she faces one of his retainers. Now he enters the room with this position. This is how he's holding the katana. Sure, I mean, there are some weird ways of holding the katana, weird from our perspective. You don't always just hold the katana like this, and the fact that he's entering like this, fine, is one of the possible guard positions in Kenjutsu. I'm not complaining about that. She kills him very easily. I find that to be strange, unless perhaps this was like a new retainer, maybe like a low-ranking samurai with not much experience in combat, not a battle-hardened one. Then sure, maybe I can see that she kind of ambushes him. If this was supposed to be a fully trained, battle-hardened, super professional samurai, then I don't think she would have engaged. I think she would have run away from him, just trying to get to the target, because, I mean, good luck. Let's be honest here. I want to say that the majority of Kunoichi would have avoided fighting experienced samurai. But once again, if this is supposed to be a low-ranking samurai, maybe someone who doesn't have a lot of experience, then sure, with the advantage of an ambush, you could have killed him even if you were a Kunoichi without as much experience in combat. So in general, disguise and infiltration was one of the skills of the historical Kunoichi, disguising themselves as geisha, maids, or other roles to gain access to restricted areas and gather information. Seduction is also something that is mentioned in some scrolls. For example, in some stories, Kunoichi used their femininity and seduction techniques to gain close proximity to important men and important people in Japanese society. Other skills that Kunoichi would have used would have been eavesdropping, spycraft, gathering intelligence, stealing documents. However, it is essential to note that the actual historical evidence for the existence and activities of Kunoichi is indeed limited. We believe they did exist, I think that that's beyond doubt, but how they performed their activities, well, we don't have a lot to work with. And of course, legends and folklore will influence some of the data. With that being said, I hope that you enjoyed this. This is pretty much my review, my full review of episode 2, and if you like this video and you want me to continue, I apologize that it took me so long to make it, but I had a few family situations. I had to fly back to Italy. I think you already know what happened. So that kind of put a pause into the development and creation of this, but I would like to continue this series, and if you like it and you want me to create the review of episode 3, please share this video, like it, leave a comment, because that helps me with the algorithm and engage the algorithm in a way that if I see good numbers, if we reach maybe 80,000 views with this episode review, then I would be more than happy to create episode 3. Thank you so much as always for your support, and thank you for watching. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Sayonara.